Hi there, everybody. So this video is going to continue talking about the good life and Aristotle, specifically his function argument. We'll start the video just by introducing Aristotle's virtuous activity account of eudaimonia. We'll then talk about function and its relation to goodness for Aristotle by giving some examples, developing an analogy, then leading into the function argument. After that, we'll revisit Aristotle's ways of rejecting hedonism and see if maybe we can fill in the dots to some of those arguments we discussed earlier. Then I'll just end with a couple last considerations. So Aristotle is one of the most famous defenders of what's called virtue theory. Virtue theories are a family of theories that approaches ethical thinking by emphasizing and centering the concept of virtue. This leads us to Aristotle's picture of eudaimonia. According to Aristotle, the good for humans turns out to be an activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there's more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. The idea here is that human flourishing or living well consists in the exercise of virtue, not the mere possession of virtue. So the proper aim of a human life, the good life, is not just to be a virtuous person, to have virtue. It's also to be in an environment and situation that allows you to practice and exercise that virtue. It's about engaging in the activity of expressing virtue. So how does Aristotle support this position? Key to Aristotle's argument is going to be the idea of a function. There's many things in this world that have a function. The heart's function is to pump blood. The eye's function is to see. A toaster's function is to make toast. A vehicle's function is to transport people or things. Similarly, we can sometimes talk about people's function. A carpenter's function is to build things. A sculptor's function is to sculpt things. A realtor's function is to help you buy and sell housing properties. In each of these cases, we can distinguish between good and bad examples of those kinds of things. There's good eyes and there's bad eyes. There's good toasters and bad toasters. There's good realtors and there's bad realtors. And in all these examples, it looks like each is a good thing of that kind to the extent that they fulfill their function well. The function of an eye is to see. And so an eye that sees well is a good eye. An eye that sees poorly is a bad eye. A toaster that burns a toast is bad. A good realtor is one that fulfills its function of helping me purchase properties. If a realtor gives me advice where I'm constantly losing out on properties, they're not a very good realtor. So we can use this as an analogy to support the idea that a human life is also good to the extent that it performs its function well. So Aristotle thinks that we need to identify the function of a human being. And Aristotle thinks the function must be something unique. A realtor's function, for instance, needs to be unique in order to explain how realtors differ from mortgage lenders. If a realtor and a mortgage lender had the same function, then there'd be no difference between the two. Similarly, the function of a human must be different from the function of other lives, otherwise we wouldn't be able to explain how human life differs from other kinds, how it differs from plant life, fish life, etc. So identifying the function of a human, according to Aristotle, requires us to find what's uniquely human. Firstly, you might think, well, one ability that human beings have is the ability to gain nutrition, to use that nutrition to sustain our lives, to keep on living. But nutrition isn't unique to humans. Plants and animals are also capable of gaining nutrients for their bodies to sustain their lives. But if that's not unique to us, it's not our function, and that means mere survival isn't what makes a human life good. And so the goal of our lives shouldn't be just to sustain our existence as long as possible, to go on living. It's going to partly depend upon the quality of that life. What about perception and intuition? We're also capable of having experiences. But this too isn't unique to humans. Animals also have this ability to have experiences of perception and intuition. So gaining experiences won't be the function of a human being, and so having a variety of experiences won't be what makes a human life good. It's at least going to partly depend upon the quality of those experiences. Now you might think, well, in addition to having experiences, we can also get pleasure from those experiences. But that ability is also not unique to human beings. It looks like animals are also capable of getting pleasure from their experiences. And so even experiencing pleasure won't be what makes a human life good, because it won't fulfill the function of a human life. Note, this isn't to say that experiencing pleasure doesn't play any role in a good life. It's just to say that experiencing pleasure is not sufficient for a good human life. It won't fulfill the nature of a human being. According to Aristotle, he thinks that what sets us apart from other animals is our faculty of reason. We don't just perceive the world around us and intuit and act intuitively as a response to stimuli. We can reason about the world around us and make plans for the future. We can consider arguments, go through premises to conclusion. And he thinks this differentiates us from other animals. And Aristotle thereby concludes that the function of a human being is to reason. Thus, a human life is good to the extent that it exercises its reason well. Now, using our rational abilities well is what Aristotle identifies as virtue. However, it's critical to recognize that Aristotle understands reason more broadly than you may be used to. Reason involves intellectual virtues and also ethical, character, and practical virtues. The intellectual virtues, these are going to be admirable character traits or excellences involving the parts of human beings that have the ability to reason themselves. So these intellectual virtues will include things like theoretical wisdom, practical wisdom, scientific knowledge, understanding, intelligence, art, and craft. All of these involve our ability to gain knowledge about the world around us, to consider evidence and premises, and to draw conclusions on the basis of that evidence and use that as a way to decide and choose what to do. But on the other side, there's also ethical, character, and practical virtues. These are admirable character traits or excellences that involve the parts of human beings that they can't reason themselves, but they can follow reason. So these parts include things like our emotions, our desires, our motivations. My fear doesn't involve the ability to reason, but my fear can listen to my reason. My reason can tell me which things are dangerous and which things are not, and can tell me how dangerous they are. So my reason can tell me that certain spiders are dangerous and other ones are not. And when I fear the dangerous spiders and don't fear the non-dangerous spiders, my fear is then listening to my reason. So some examples of these kind of virtues include things like courage, honesty, kindness, generosity, humility. These are character traits that involve a number of emotions and desires and motivations that can still respond to our reason. Now that we have that understanding of how Aristotle is using the idea of reason and virtue much more broadly than maybe we're used to, we can put all this together into Aristotle's function argument. The idea is that a human life is good to the extent that it performs its function well, or excellently. This is meant to be supported by that analogy. A toaster is good to the extent that it performs its function well. A car is good to the extent that it performs its function of transportation well. A human life is good to the extent that it performs its function well. Now, a thing's function is what's peculiar or unique to the kind of thing that it is, so that we can distinguish it from other kinds of things. And now Aristotle thinks that our rational capacities is what's peculiar or unique to human life, and so the function of human beings is to reason. And thus, a human life will be good to the extent that it exercises those rational capacities well or excellently, and to the extent that it lives a life of virtuous activity. Now, this function argument might explain why he found certain arguments against hedonism convincing, even though they initially seem rather weak. Consider the argument from evil pleasures. This argument says that, well, hedonism must be wrong because pleasure derived from evil is not as good as pleasure derived from right acts. But the objection here is that that argument seems to confuse moral goodness and something being good for a person. And hedonism is a theory about what's good for a person, what's involved in their own well-being. It's not a theory about what's morally good. But Aristotle's appeal to function might improve this argument against hedonism because Aristotle's explanation for why evil pleasures are bad isn't merely because they're immoral. Aristotle believes that a person who gets pleasure from evil acts is exercising their distinctively human faculties poorly. And that is meant to partly explain why the vicious person is failing to live the good life for a human. We also considered the swine argument in the last video. That argument claimed that hedonism is wrong because the best life for a swine wouldn't be an appropriate life for a human to aim for. Comparing the best life of a human to that of a swine seems demeaning to the worth of human life. We can aim for something more noble than that. The worry with this is that hedonism doesn't have this implication since humans are capable of deriving pleasure from different sources than swine. Pigs can get pleasure from eating, drinking, and sex. Yes, we can get pleasure from those things too, but if that's all we focused on, like a pig, we'd be missing out on all the other pleasures we can get. Because we can also get pleasure from reading, doing philosophy, engaging in conversation with friends. We shouldn't ignore those pleasures. But Aristotle's appeal to function might again, improve this argument. Yes, the hedonist is correct that we would miss out on lots of intellectual pleasures. However, Aristotle is suggesting that the best explanation for why we find the comparison so demeaning isn't because we'd be missing out on pleasure, but because such a life would just fail to fulfill our human nature. We can also revisit the experience machine in light of Aristotle. When you think about the experience machine and people not wanting to go in, you can ask what aspect of our well-being would be missing in a life inside the machine. Well, there's this passage from Nozick where he says, a second reason to not plug in is that we want to be a certain way, to be a certain sort of person. Someone floating in a tank is an indeterminate blob. There's no answer to the question of what a person is like who's long been in the tank. Is he or she courageous, kind, intelligent, witty, loving? There's no way he or she is. Why should we be concerned only with how our time is filled, but not with what we are? Notice how well this fits with Aristotle's conception of the good life. On Aristotle's view, being a person with virtuous character intrinsically contributes to our well-being. We don't want just to get pleasure. We also want to be a good person, a courageous person, a brave person, an honest person. According to Nozick, when we're in the experience machine, there's no answer to us being a certain kind of person. We can't say that we're a courageous person in the experience machine when we run in to save a child from a burning building because we didn't make that choice. Rather, it was just the machine making us, giving us the experience of running into the building. Whether we would do that on our own, we just don't know. Moreover, as I said, in the experience machine, there's no exercise of virtue, since it's a simulation where your actions are determined by the computer's program rather than your own character. All of this is pre-programmed. You just go in the machine and then the tape runs. Lastly, I want to leave you with a final thought. Aristotle's picture of the good life and his function argument can also seem intuitively compelling when we consider some examples. People often talk about cases where someone lets their talents go to waste. So a person with musical capacities might let those go to waste and thereby fail to live up to their full potential as a musician. And we often think that that's regrettable, for instance. Of course, someone who doesn't live up to their potential as a musician might still be a really good person, live a really good life, since there's more to life than music. But nonetheless, analogously, we might worry that a person failing to exercise and improve their distinctively human faculties would thereby fail to live up to their full potential as a human being, just like the musician failed to live up to their potential as a musician. Of course, persons that fail to live up to their full potential, fail to fully exercise their human capacities, can still live happy lives that are good overall, but we might think that their lives still fall short of being among the best life that humans could aim to achieve. This isn't meant to be a fully developed thought. It's meant solely just to give students some food for thought for trying to work through these issues on their own. So that's all for this video. Y'all have a good day.